who will introduce our speaker today.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for being here. I wanted to start with a slide on the land acknowledgement, because as we acknowledge land, we should think about what that means. And what it means is that this land people had been displaced, dispossessed, and indeed genocide was created on these various lands. It's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Amira Aker. She's an environmental epidemiologist and assistant professor at Boston University. She received her bachelor's degree at the University of Waterloo, her master's of public health at George Washington University, and has a PhD in environmental health from University of Michigan. She's published quite a bit, including a very important article that was published in June of 2025 in the American Journal of Public Health that's specifically related to the topic at hand. So if you want to read more about the environmental impact of the devastation of Gaza, I refer you to that article. I don't know how to advance this slide here. I wanted to just say a few words to help put all this into context. Because while the focus today is on the environmental exposures, it's important to recognize that there are a myriad of health effects that are associated with these array of exposures. And more importantly, it's important to think about the states that have enabled the exposures, the occupation, the apartheid, the ecological erasures that lead to the exposures that are going to be talked about. And if you take a step back and say, how is that allowed to happen? We have to think about racism, anti-Palestinian racism, as well as anti-Semitism. I forgot to mention that Dr. Aker herself is Palestinian, and so knows this topic quite well from many perspectives. And what drives racism, of course, is the geopolitical and economic aspects and the quest for land and resources. So as we listen to this presentation, think about where it's coming from and what we could do about it. I also want to draw attention to the fact that the conditions that are being talked about, the exposures, the effects, didn't just start in October 2023. The siege goes back of Gaza to 2007 and arguably decades before, when the Nakba happened and people were driven out of their land. It's important to understand these narratives and what led to these things, because if we only address the exposures and not the underlying causes, that we'll never have a sustainable health equity situation. So it's important to think about the discourse that allows it to happen. And I quickly, want to state that it is not anti-Jewish in any shape or form to be calling out a genocide, to be calling out the humanitarian crisis that exists in Palestine. In fact, when Zionism first started growing up as an ideology at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, the vast majority of Jews in the world were against it. People were afraid that what would this mean for the Jews in other countries, but also people were aware that it meant driving out all the people who were the indigenous to the land that were living there. Keep in mind that Jewish people's right to defend themselves from extermination doesn't give the right to oppress others. And even back in 1967, before the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, that it was a group of Jewish people in Israel, and this was in her arts, they took full-page ad to say, holding on to the occupied territories will turn us into a nation of murderers and murder victims. How very prescient. If you want to learn more about how anti-Palestinian racism is promulgated in Canada, the Jewish Faculty Network, of which I'm a part, has an excellent report on CJA. You can go to their website and see it. So we're hoping that certainly if people do what they need to do in 2043, we won't be asking people to do land acknowledgements for the area of Gaza, as you could see here. So with that brief introduction, I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Aker.
So Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction. And it moves us perfectly to my presentation. So, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you all today. And I hope to talk about the impacts of environmental destruction during conflicts more broadly, but then really sort of focus on Gaza as a case study. And you can imagine this is a very large topic. So, I hope to use a few case studies throughout the presentation to better describe these effects. So, when we think about health around conflicts or war, we typically think of mortality. How many people were killed? How many were combatants? We may even think of things like morbidity, be it injury due to the conflict or diseases indirectly caused by the conflict, perhaps via lack of access to care or increased vulnerability. And infectious diseases, infectious diseases in particular have long been acknowledged and considered a key outcome of wars and conflict for combatants and civilians alike. And here's an example of an advertisement from World War I around hygiene and infectious disease. But what about these effects of war? So this is a picture of Syrians trying to save their agricultural lands after a bomb fell on their lands. This is what the environment looks like after the US sprayed Vietnam with Agent Orange, a chemical weapon of war. This is a destroyed farm in Ukraine, one of hundreds. This is a nuclear bomb tested in Algeria in the desert town of Regan by the French. The French had conducted more than 200 nuclear weapon tests, first in the Sahara Desert from 1960 to 1966, and then in the French Polynesia from 1966 to 1996, and never cleaned any of them up. We tend to think or talk about all of these effects as though they were just collateral damage, but these effects reverberate for generations, casting a shadow through our reliance on the land we live on to our very genes. So there has been some acknowledgement of this, of course. So this study, for example, tries to point out all the effects of conflict and describe them as key drivers of maternal-child health around conflicts. And they identified the destruction of infrastructure and the depletion and contamination of natural resources as part of the key changes. But even within this figure, the weight and importance of the environment is hidden in terms like natural resources. And we also see that nutrition is listed as a determinant of health. And we've seen how nutrition can impact not just maternal health, but the health of several generations. We've seen and studied the effects of destroying agricultural lands and denying food as a weapon of war. Most famously, we came to understand the epigenetic changes from studies around famine. So, for example, the Dutch experienced a famine in the years 1944 to 1945 because Nazi Germany deliberately starved the population to punish them. And as you can see in this figure, the figures colored in orange were the individuals who had experienced famine, and the cohort followed the grandchildren of mothers who had experienced that famine and identified detrimental transgenerational effects in the grandchildren. Similar transgenerational effects were also observed during the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1961. This was yet another man-made famine forced on a population for a political agenda. And this purposeful destruction of the environment has been used as a method to punish or oppress a population for centuries. And the purpose is not just to starve necessarily, but many oppressors choose to induce long-term consequences in order to break a people's connection to their land. So the picture on the left shows you the marshes of Iraq from the 1970s. A UNESCO heritage site, this region had been inhabited from the 3rd century BC. And in the 1990s, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq then, drained the swamps to punish the people who lived there. And this was made worse after the destruction of dams by the US military and then exacerbated by climate change. And we're going to come back to this concept of climate change and conflicts later on. And staying in Iraq a little bit longer, modern warfare, compared to warfare of the past, is unique in its artillery and bombs, which are filled with rare minerals and heavy metals in our so-called technologically advanced age. So these bombs don't just immediately kill, they linger and continue their damage for years to come. So for example, in the US, they dropped 75,000 bombs on Iraq from 2003 to 2016. And this resulted in severe heavy metal contamination in regions around military sites and industrial sites, as you can see in the figure here. The darker blue represents more heavy metal contamination. And this has been linked with internal exposure across children and adults, and has been associated with things like congenital birth defects across Iraqi cities. And so there's another part of the story missing. Climate change is arguably the crisis of our age and severely impacts our health. And military activity from across the globe accounts for 5.5% of all global carbon emissions. However, despite this significant contribution, this number does not include the emissions that occur during actual wars or conflicts. So this is the 5.5% is simply from military, establishing the military, running their activities, and maintaining their different bases. In fact, if we were to consider the world militaries as a country, it would have the fourth highest carbon footprint. So just to back up a little bit, this is for the first poll of the presentation. I'm going to wait for instructions from Donald, maybe, or George. Oh, here it is. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of none of the above so far. Some guesses of the Paris Agreement. Okay. Okay, so how do I do this? Do I just close this now? Okay, so we're going to get to this answer in a second. Just so to give you an idea of just how large this industry is, world militaries, which of the world militaries, excuse me, US, China, and Russia account for over half of the expenditure worldwide. And this results in an annual $2.24 trillion. So given the large share of the US's military power, I'm just going to focus on them for the moment. So this figure shows you that the US military emits more carbon dioxide than entire countries, including Morocco, Peru, and several Northern European countries. This is equivalent to 257 million cars, which is more than double the number of cars in use in the US. And to get back to the poll question, you may wonder why this is the case and how they get away with it. And this is because in the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of the answers in the poll, this is an international treaty aimed at addressing climate change. This included a military and mission exemption from targets and reporting requirements for national security concerns. In 2015, the Paris Agreement included a voluntary option for militaries to report and offset their carbon dioxide. However, studies have shown that there are very few reports available from military sources, and whatever reports that do exist vastly underreport their emissions. So it's kind of like a sort of Paris agreement, but not really. None of the above, I think, is probably the better response. And we're waiting to see what's going to come out of COP30. So military activity can impact the environment through several mechanisms. First, there are the indirect military emissions, and this includes resource extraction, the manufacturing of weaponry, the transportation of that weaponry worldwide, and then the building and running of the infrastructure used for deployment and training. Then we move on to the direct military emissions. This includes the greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicle operations, fuel leaks and contamination, and then from the actual combat emissions themselves. And then lastly, we have the post-conflict effect or the post-military effect. And here we're talking about the direct destruction of the environment during the conflict. So this includes the air pollution and debris from the destruction of the infrastructure, water and soil contamination, habitat loss and biodiversity, as well as which kind of cycle into accelerated climate change. So let's think about those indirect effects a little bit more and the sheer number of military bases in the world. This figure shows the extent of the imperial arm that is the US and its presence in 80 countries worldwide through military bases. There are 750 bases with over 170,000 troops currently operating. If you just think about the carbon emissions required for creating these imperialistic bases around the world, let alone the maintenance of all of these. And of course, it's not just the US. Here's a map showing the military bases across the continent of Africa. And because military bases are set up not necessarily to control it from a military perspective, but also where they can control resource extraction, you see here the number of bases across the continent, particularly in states with active mining sites. And we're going to come back to this towards the end of the presentation. So I show you these examples to make the case that we know, not just instinctively, but through scientific studies, that the destruction of the environment can and has caused adverse health effects for several generations. And this issue should get the attention it deserves. And after years of advocacy, the International Court of Justice had finally accepted including the climate obligations as major implications for ecocide law. This just happened in July of this year, which was a massive step forward. So now that we've set up our understanding on how conflicts can impact the environment, let's dive into the specific case around Gaza. And this is obviously particularly relevant today as we witness the ongoing genocide live streamed on our screens. So now over 2 years into the attacks, and despite the announcement of a so-called ceasefire, the genocide continues. In fact, over 250 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire. The official number is somewhere around 70,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. This doesn't include the over 1,000 Palestinians killed in the West Bank, something that our media never covers. Of the 70,000, at least 20,000 of them are children. However, some estimates report, and this is an estimate of April 2025, that the real number is closer to almost 700,000 Palestinians. And the latest Lancet study estimates 3 million years of life lost in Gaza. And despite these horrific numbers, the long-term repercussions have yet to be considered in detail. So before we dive into what's happening in Gaza, we really have to take a step back and look at a very brief history of Palestine, especially because the mainstream media continues to paint the conditions as though these were just two fighting neighbors and nothing more. And this is sort of following on to exactly what Annalie had mentioned at the start of this presentation. So here are some photos of Palestine pre-colonization. The region of Palestine is a strip of land between 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, and for thousands of years had been home to an indigenous population that evolved and welcomed migrants from across the continents. It had been known as Palest, Palestine, Philistine for 4,000 years with no strict borders because nation states did not exist at the time. This was until the British colonized the region after World War I and marked out its new borders, just like the British and the French did across the Middle East and Africa. So until then, Palestinians lived in peace. There was none of this invented dichotomy of Arabs and Jews because Judaism was and remains outside of Europe a religion and not an ethnicity. So Palestinians across their diverse ethnicities and religions who had been there for thousands of years and those who arrived later lived in peace. This was until Europeans invented a political ideology that aspired for an established physical home for Jewish people, known as Zionism. And this was, of course, the result of the rampant anti-Jewish bigotry across Europe. Zionists began arriving in Palestine, many as refugees, but most as self-professed colonizers. And European powers decided to give their new colonized lands to the Jewish Europeans. Now, to establish this new Zionist state, over 50% of the land was given to the European Zionist colonizers, and a so-called war was fought against the indigenous peoples, and Israel won by expelling 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and destroying 530 villages. This today is described as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Every Palestinian alive today has their family's Nakba story. Many Palestinians escaped the Nakba to Gaza, to the coast in Gaza. And today, over 80% of the population living in Gaza are refugees from those villages that were wiped out by Israel. And this is why Gaza is considered one of the most populated regions in the world. So as you can see in the map, the settler colony continued its land grab, expansion, and occupation. Palestinians' land shrunk to Gaza, the Gaza Strip on the coast, and West Bank on the border of Jordan. And the conditions in Gaza were always especially horrific, leading to more resistance movements. And Israel placed the region under a military blockade in 2007. So now let's take a deeper dive into Gaza on its own. So this is a 40-kilometer stretch of coastal land. It's only 40 kilometers. And since 2007, Israel's blockade eliminated freedom of movement in and out of the Strip by land, sea, or air. So this is also why Gaza, you may have heard the term, that is considered an open air concentration camp of 2 million people or more than 2 million people. So even though Palestinians had traditionally relied on the sea for sustenance, fishing was prohibited to only a few nautical miles from the shore. And even prior to October 2023, food insecurity was already an issue for Palestine or Palestinians in Gaza because of the military blockade. So this constant bombardment and the military blockade led to significant deterioration of the environment prior to the current genocide. And here are some of the reports that had described these effects in previous years. You can see that they're quite old now, but just to really show that this is not a new issue. It's just an extreme issue now. So a year ago, my colleagues and I decided to produce a review of these environmental consequences that were largely captured in the gray literature and some in the peer-reviewed literature. This was partly due to our own backgrounds in environmental health, but also because we wanted to describe how the impacts of the Israeli bombardment was not only impacting Palestinians in Gaza today, but how the destruction was going to have repercussions for generations to come. And here's a QR code if you wanted to try to find our article. So it will be impossible to cover all of the topics that were included in our paper, but these were sort of like the different chapters we had. And I'm going to try my best to try to give you highlights for each of these sections. So let's start with greenhouse gas emissions. So the carbon emissions in the first 60 days alone, so this is only in October and November 2023, exceeded the annual carbon footprint of more than 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. This is equivalent to burning 150,000 tons of gold. And this was largely driven by fighter jets from Israel, and which were supplied by the US. Let's move on to water, wastewater, and hygiene. So this time lapse shows the damages to infrastructural facilities in Gaza. This is up to date to July 2024. So some of these numbers are old, but they still kind of show you just how horrible things have gotten. So the destruction that you see here includes things like desalination plants and water pumping stations and wastewater treatment plants. And as of last month, almost 80% of all structures have been destroyed or damaged. Only 3 water storage units or reservoirs remain undamaged, and none of Gaza's wastewater treatment facilities are currently operational. This is a figure that just gives you an idea of what water looks like in Gaza, water access. So I want to just point your attention to the second faucet here. So the WHO recommends that every person has to have access to 100 liters of water per day in order to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Before October 2023, Gaza only had access to 88 liters per person per day. The WHO emergency minimum, and this is just for survival, is 7.5 liters per person per day. Gaza, and this came out in November 2023, only had access to 3. People in Gaza, and this number rate stayed relatively stable throughout the last 2 years, lost 97% of their average daily water consumption for basic needs, including hydration, cooking, and hygiene. And just to sort of give you an idea of what these numbers look like. So I had talked about 100 liters per person today. Gazans, especially up in the north, only had access to about 3. Flushing a single toilet takes 6 liters of water. Washing your hands requires 4 liters. Showering requires 40 liters of water. And you may ask what a lot of Palestinians have been doing in order to survive. And most of them have been trying to access the agricultural wells. However, and this is a story on its own that I won't have time to get into, the water in the agricultural wells is 30 times saltier than fresh water. So this has posed an incredible risk to vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and babies and people with kidney disease. So if we were to look at the impacts of all of this, in June 2025 alone, there were over 37,000 respiratory infections. There were, in 2024, the cases of acute watery diarrhea increased 36-fold, bloody diarrhea increased 24-fold, and acute jaundice syndrome, which is indicative of Hep A, increased 384-fold. And it is currently winter in Gaza. It has been pouring rain and all the tents are flooded. Keep in mind that 80% of all building structures have been completely destroyed in Gaza. So the majority of the population right now live in these tents. And many people are currently sleeping on water-soaked mattresses or on the floor. And none of the equipment to actually start rebuilding the homes is currently being allowed in by Israel. So let's get into chemical contamination and debris. With the systematic destruction of Gaza, this graphic depicts what happens every hour, night, or day in Gaza. And this is, again, for November 2023, but it stayed relatively consistent throughout the genocide with some ups and downs. 42 bombs were dropped every single hour. That means that during this presentation, 12 buildings were destroyed, 15 people will be murdered, 6 of whom are children, and an additional 35 people would have been injured. This equates to approximately 100,000 tons of bombs since October 2023. You recall that the US dropped on Iraq 75,000 tons of bombs, and that was over a span of over a decade. And this also included 2,000-pound bombs that were dropped on people's tents and a lot of community centers. So you can see, I hope you can see, like, this is just a human being here, and you can see how large the craters are from these 2,000-pound bombs. Again, just to sort of put this in perspective, the number of bombs that were dropped on Gaza surpassed all the bombs that were used in World War II by, as you can see, quite a large amount. And this is just some of the photos of Gaza today. This is a figure that was produced by the United Nations Development Program. They estimate 61 million tons of debris currently in Gaza, and it will take over 20 years to clear. And this is based on the assumption that the military blockade is lifted and 105 trucks with 19-ton capacity operating in 8-hour shifts every single day are available to carry the debris out. And of course, when we talk about this debris, we're not just talking about dust and particulate matter, we're also talking about asbestos, because a lot of these, especially the refugee camps, were built decades ago. We're talking about all sorts of different heavy metal contamination from the bombs that fell on Gaza. We're talking about the unexploded ordnance that remain in Gaza because I can't remember the fraction off the top of my head now. I want to say about a fifth of the artillery have remain unexploded in Gaza today. And it also includes the thousands of people that remain dead under the rubble. So not only does this have to be removed in a safe way, but in a respectful way. This is just a very quick video that shows you, it's a drone imagery of the destruction in Gaza. This was produced by Sky News in the UK. So we've talked quite a bit about Gaza, but I wanted to put another quick poll question up about how many attacks you think occurred against Palestinians living in the West Bank by Israeli settlers last month in October 2025. Okay, so many of you guessed correctly. Settler violence has peaked. It's been ongoing for quite some time. And in last month alone, there were the UN logged 260 attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, largely burning their olive trees and their fruit orchards. And this, of course, I don't have time to go into the attacks that occurred in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Yemen. So now I'm going to go into noise pollution, and hopefully the video works here. Let's just quickly explain this. So noise pollution is another aspect that's often overlooked. Palestinians are forced to live with the constant sound of drones. And this is referred to something called the zannane. And this video is a Palestinian journalist named Bisan who lives in Gaza explaining the sound that they're forced to hear all the time. Hopefully this works. Is it working?
No.
No?
We're not getting the vocal.
All right. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. But I urge you to go listen to this. If you just type in zannane, which is like right here, you can hear just a slow frequency sound that is something the Palestinians are forced to hear. The noise is used as a form of psychological torture. The sound induces stress and makes Palestinians feel constantly watched. Of course, noise pollution is also linked with various outcomes, from mental health outcomes to things like obesity to even cancers. So let's get into food insecurity. So to be clear, this is a man-made famine, which Palestinians in Gaza are now just starting to emerge from just a little bit. There was from March 2025 up until just a few weeks ago, no aid was entering Gaza at all, and over 134 children died from starvation. And there were some attempts some last year to do some airdrops in order to supply the people of Gaza with aid. But this is an incredibly ineffective method, as the airdrops were very dangerous and actually killed many people on the ground. And a lot of the foods that were in those airdrops also contain things like pork products, which the majority of Palestinians cannot eat, or stale food. And the 104 days of airdrops supplied Gaza with 4 days worth of food. This is a figure produced by the UN that shows the number of trucks that were intercepted by Israel. So right now, the UN has been pre-positioned outside of Israel and not allowed in order to provide that aid. They have enough food parcels for 1.1 million people, flour for 2.1 million individuals, and shelter supplies for 1.3 million people. So much of this aid is still being blocked. The UN just yesterday put out another call saying that less than half of the trucks that were agreed upon to enter Gaza have not been entering. And you may have heard of the global flotilla, the Samud flotilla. Every attempt to try to break the siege had been intercepted, and many of the passengers on these ships were also tortured. So what I also really wanted to point out here is that Palestine, if you remember from your social studies classes back in middle school, is in the Fertile Crescent. And our communities had been farmers and working in agriculture for thousands of years. So the starvation is occurring not through just the lack of food coming in, but through the very destruction of our agricultural lands throughout the Strip. So this map over here shows you the destruction of the agricultural lands in Gaza. 91.7% of all the lands have been completely destroyed, and 97.1% of all of our tree crops have been destroyed. This includes things like our olive trees and our fruit orchards and all of that. And 82.4% of all vegetable crops have been destroyed. Let's move on to susceptible populations. There are many. I won't have time to go into any of this, but I wanted to put this one figure up that just depicts the trauma that a child in Gaza experienced. So if we were to take a 16-year-old child in Gaza, this is their sixth Israeli offense that they have experienced, with this one obviously being the most damaging. And you can imagine the kind of acute trauma, chronic trauma, and intergenerational trauma that is occurring throughout these constant bombardments and what this one is going to entail moving forward. Since this is an occupational health crowd, I also wanted to talk about workers. So this is a report by the Human Rights Watch, and I just wanted to point out this one paragraph. I hope you can read it, but it basically calls out the Israeli government for deliberately targeting workers coming out and engineers and essential workers coming to fix the pipes for water access. Similarly, this is a report by Oxfam that also condemns the targeted killing of water engineers in Gaza who are just out to try to do their job and get access to water to Palestinians in Gaza. And we can't talk about any of this without talking about access to healthcare, because you can imagine, I'm sure, that all of these become amplified, all the effects become amplified when there's no access to healthcare. And I also wanted to focus again on those healthcare workers to focus on that occupational health aspect. So there have been multiple reports, probably even dozens of reports that have come out talking about the deliberate targeting of healthcare workers in the last 2+ years. This includes paramedics, doctors, nurses, all sorts of healthcare workers, attacking of ambulances. And you can see many of these, from Amnesty International, United Nations. There is even an article about this in the BMJ. This is an article that was published that tried to follow the number of reported attacks on healthcare workers per day. This is only accurate to June 2024, so this doesn't include some of the attacks on the larger hospitals that occurred later on. But you can see that for some of the days, it went up to 14 attacks on healthcare workers in Gaza. And a UN report also tried to highlight this a little bit more. So I'm just going to read a section from this report. The report found that the Israeli security forces had deliberately killed, detained, and tortured medical personnel and targeted medical vehicles while tightening their siege on Gaza. These actions constitute the war crimes of willful killing and mistreatment and the destruction of protected civilian property and the war crime against humanity of extermination. And I would be remiss not to mention Dr. Hussam al-Safiyyeh, this doctor over here. He's the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital. And this picture of him here is of him walking to the military, voluntarily walking to the military tank in order to try to protect and save his hospital and his patients. He has been detained without charge since December of last year and has been reportedly been tortured since. And then lastly, I wanted to get into land loss trauma. So we also need to understand the impact of the environmental destruction on a community and societal level. Not only is the destruction of the environment impacting human health, it is attempting to destroy the very connection to land and sense of identity. So Palestinians view their connection to their orchards and olive trees as an integral part of self. And many of these themes are present in our stories around the olive tree. So there's a sense of auna. The olive harvest is a time of community, solidarity, and joy. It also ensures sutra, which is a sense of protection because a father can pass on his orchard for many generations to come. The olive tree can also take 15 years to bear fruit, encompassing the deep feeling of sumud or steadfastness of the Palestinian community. Palestinians often refer to having sumud as deep as the roots of the olive tree to speak of their resistance to injustice and colonization. And some final thoughts on Gaza, because this is at a university. Palestinians, many do not know, actually have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. We also have one of the, if not the highest per capita rate of PhDs and MDs. Yet every single university and 97% of our schools in Gaza have been completely destroyed. And in order to remove the complicity that a lot of Western institutions continue to uphold in the genocide in Israel, one important thing they must do is to try to shift investment from war-related industries to more ethical research partnerships. So while the situation in Gaza is particularly horrifying and continuing due to the ongoing complicity of Western governments and their institutions, the destruction of the environment during conflict, unfortunately, is not unique. So we're going to very briefly explore some of these other conflicts and their impacts on the environment, because it's really important for us to understand just to connect how all of these things are connected. So let's get into Congo, third pole of my presentation. What is the Democratic Republic of Congo known for? Okay. So it is all the above. So Congo is known for a lot of things, including the genocide of its people by King Leopold and all the beautiful music styles and everything in between. And cobalt also has over half of the world's reserves of cobalt. And cobalt is incredibly important for us to be able to run much of our technology, our phones, and a lot of the bombs that have been used, unfortunately, worldwide, in conflicts worldwide. And because of the importance of the rare minerals that are available in Congo, since this has led to a lot of poverty in the country, unfortunately. So you think that this is something that may have tried to uplift the people of Congo, but due to I can go on to a rant here. Let's just say that since October 2023, 7 million Congolese have been displaced from their homes. It is considered one of the deadliest conflicts since the Second World War. And the demand for the DRC's vast mineral wealth fuels this violence. Armed groups seize control of mines to fund their operations, while multinational corporations and corrupt governments also play a role in the exploitation of these resources. The military-industrial complex, which is heavily reliant on a list of these critical minerals, essential for high-performance military technologies. And they include rare earth elements, including cobalt and tungsten and others, many of which are mined in the DRC. And the DRC is also home to more than half of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world. It actually covers 70% of the entire country. However, the DRC also has one of the highest rates of deforestation worldwide. And in this situation, we see the cycle of environmental damage and violence in the DRC. Mining and other extraction driven by global powers lead to environmental degradation, which increase the cases of exploiting natural resources for financial gain by armed forces, leading to displacement and further instability. Briefly touch upon the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So as many of us know, the Russian invasion began in February 2022. And within a year, by March 2023, there was a release of 33 million tons of greenhouse gases, 14,000 fires related to the conflict, and 570 toxic spills. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam on June 6, 2023 is considered one of the worst environmental catastrophes in Europe since Chernobyl. And the breach released an estimated 18 cubic kilometers of water, flooding a large area and inundating over 1,000 potential pollution sources, including landfills and sewage facilities and industrial sites. So a lot of this mobilized waste and toxic substances also includes things like oil spills and dispersal of military pollutants and unexploded ordnance. The collapse of the dam also disrupted the water supply to major cities and irrigation systems for farmlands, with long-term consequences for agriculture and the livelihoods of millions. Interestingly, Ukraine is also home to 35% of all of Europe's biodiversity, representing 74,000 species of animals, plants, and fungi. And over 20%, and this number has gone up now, over 20% of protected areas have been affected, including 2.9 million hectares of the Emerald Network, which is a network across Europe in order to try to maintain that biodiversity across the continent. So in conclusion, the impacts of conflicts on the environment are wide and complex, and these impacts can be traced back to the resources extracted to maintain those military activities, to the military infrastructure, to the greenhouse gas emissions related to the military vehicle operations, the destruction of the actual environment, the environment during the actual conflict, as well as the long-lasting impacts of the connection to land. And understanding the context behind these conflicts is essential to understanding the environmental health effects of each individual conflict. And with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.